1. Leroya Moore. She was known in East Haven as a quiet mother trying to keep a large family afloat, a woman in her late 30s navigating bills, school schedules, and the frayed edges of a difficult life. In late spring of 2015, police entered her small home on Strong Street and found what would anchor one of the most wrenching cases in Connecticut memory. The mother was Leroya Moore, then in her mid-30s. Her youngest children were Alicia, 6 years old, and Darren, 7 years old. What unfolded after that day would lead to a courtroom in New Haven, a panel of 3 judges, and a sentence measured not in years of rehabilitation, but in permanence. Prosecutors later told the court that both children died from antihistamine intoxication, a conclusion based on the autopsies. The defense did not dispute that the children died in their home, but they argued Moore had spiraled into a state of religious delusion, telling a psychiatrist that she believed she was baptizing the children because God had directed her toward a terrible fate. This explanation, offered months later in clinical interviews, did not align with the medical findings, and it could not soften the stark reality of the loss. The 3-judge panel heard both narratives in painstaking detail, weighing science and psychology against each other with sobering care. Investigators built their case methodically. From the earliest hours, police preserved the scene and gathered statements that traced Moore's actions and state of mind. Over time, court records and witness testimony filled in gaps. The note language about sending the children to heaven, the references to religious fear, the absence of a plausible external threat. In the months that followed, the father of the children addressed local reporters with quiet grief, describing Alicia and Darren not as case facts, but as the vibrant, irreplaceable center of a family. Those public moments, soft-spoken, halting, were reminders that an investigation is not only a search for evidence, it is also a bridge between what happened and those who must live with it. The trial began in early 2019, and by late March, the 3-judge panel returned its judgment, guilty on 2 counts of murder. The court rejected an insanity defense after hearing from experts on both sides, concluding that Moore understood the nature of her actions. The decision was delivered without theatrics, only the formal cadence that accompanies the most serious crimes. Reporters in the gallery recorded a brief, heavy silence, the kind that follows a verdict that was widely anticipated, yet still lands with force. Sentencing came at the end of June in the same year. The court imposed the maximum term allowed, 120 years in prison. News accounts noted that Moore, then 39 years old, addressed the bench and spoke of love for her children, words that could not move the outcome in a courtroom bound to law and to loss already measured. Some outlets reported that the term allowed for no possibility of parole, a legal seal on a life that would be spent in state custody. Outside, cameras captured the faces of relatives and community members, their reactions restrained but unmistakably raw. Psychologists who analyzed the case pointed to a complex blend of stress, possible mental illness, and escalating religious fixation as a frame for understanding, though not excusing, the crimes. The court's rejection of legal insanity underscored that, in the eyes of the law, her awareness rose above the threshold of criminal responsibility. In the years since, brief anniversaries of the case have been marked not by renewed debate, but by a simple fact that closes this chapter. Leroya Moore is serving a sentence of 120 years in a Connecticut prison. 2. Cassandra Nazario. She was a young woman from Waterbury, whose name rarely reached beyond her circle of friends until a July night turned her into a central figure in a case that would haunt Connecticut for years. Cassandra Nazario was in her mid-20s when prosecutors said she took part in a plan that targeted 23-year-old Rachel Lorado Sabatella, a South African native building a life in the city. Public records offer little about Nazario's upbringing or work history, but witnesses described a turbulent relationship life that overlapped with Rachel's world. In the months after the killing, investigators heard rumors, resentments, and a volatile triangle that would become the spine of the state's theory. Prosecutors later told a court that the spark was personal and intensely emotional. In testimony and filings referenced during the co-defendants' trial, the state said Nazario and her boyfriend, Miles Johnson, believed Rachel was connected to him intimately, that she might be pregnant, and that there were alarming claims about disease. Those claims, disputed in their specifics, were part of a fevered buildup that, according to evidence, culminated in a deliberate plan. The pair spent the day preparing, buying dark clothing and a knife, details Nazario acknowledged when she eventually chose to cooperate. Experts would later describe the psychology of such cases as a mix of jealousy, perceived betrayal, and escalating grievance, the kind of pressure that narrows a person's choices until violence is wrongly justified in their mind. What happened next, the state argued, unfolded first inside Rachel's Waterbury apartment and then miles away at Black Rock State Park in Watertown. Evidence presented at trial showed Rachel was stabbed inside her home, and months later, a hiker discovered remains in the park, bound and hidden among bags and blankets. The discovery date was in mid-September of the year following the summer attack, a grim confirmation of what Rachel's loved ones already feared. Reporters who covered the case noted the careful, clinical language of courtroom testimony, a tone chosen to preserve dignity while making the record clear. Those facts, location, method, concealment were enough for a jury to convict Johnson and for Nazario, facing her own charges, to plead guilty. Detectives pieced the case together through interviews, phone data, and the intertwined statements of both defendants. Nazario admitted her role, telling authorities she helped plan the attack and that the pair armed themselves in advance. When Johnson went to trial in the spring of the year after, jurors heard that sequence in detail and returned a guilty verdict. That conviction strengthened the state's hand as Nazario moved towards sentencing, and it set the stage for her cooperation agreement to be weighed alongside the harm already done. In public comments, officials emphasized the painstaking nature of the investigation and the weight borne by Rachel's family, who sat through hearings that revisited the same painful timeline. In the summer that followed, a judge imposed Nazario's punishment, a term of 50 years, with execution suspended after 25 years to serve, reflecting both the gravity of the crime and her decision to plead guilty and testify. News accounts recorded the court's formal language and the stillness that followed, while a separate hearing earlier that month had already ended with Johnson receiving 55 years. State press releases and local coverage made the sequence plain. A plea in April of the year before, a sentence in mid-August, and a community left to reckon with the loss of a young woman whose promise was cut short. Psychologically, the portrait that emerges is not of a singular pathology, but of combustible emotions, jealousy, fear, anger condensing into a plan that Nazario later acknowledged. The court did not accept excuses, but it did note her cooperation in calibrating the final term. Today, records show Cassandra Nazario is serving a sentence that requires at least 25 years in state prison before any possibility of supervised release. 3. Ellen Wink. She was a familiar face in Norwalk civic circles, a former local official who once worked in election administration and knew the rhythms of city politics. Ellen Wink was in her mid-60s when a landlord-tenant conflict on Nelson Avenue became the center of her story. Neighbors knew her as outspoken and forceful. Tenants and police had already seen friction over access to the rental space and belongings. The man renting from her was Kurt Lametta, in his mid-50s, a tenant who insisted on his right to privacy and stability. In late January of the year 2022, their running dispute would end in a confrontation that neither community ties nor public standing could soften once the facts reached a courtroom. In the months before the shooting, the relationship had frayed. Police testimony later described warnings to reduce contact, allegations that utilities were cut, and a separate misdemeanor case accused Wink of a criminal lockout, the kind of landlord harassment that prosecutors argued revealed motive. That background became a through line at trial, with jurors hearing that tensions escalated despite prior interventions. The state also introduced evidence that, in the days before the shooting, Wink searched online for information about handguns and ammunition, a detail the prosecution said showed preparation rather than panic. Defense filings signaled shifting strategies over time, including potential claims of self-defense, extreme emotional disturbance, or even legal insanity. What happened inside the rental on the day of the killing was captured, in part, by the tenant himself. Lametta recorded their final exchange on his phone, a short, intense clip in which he complained about repeated intrusions and the handling of his belongings. Seconds later, shots were fired, and the recording became one of the most consequential exhibits the jurors would weigh. Reporters in the courthouse described how the video's stark audio stripped away speculation and anchored the timeline in the tenant's own voice. The evidence convinced the jury that this was not a justified act of defense, but an unlawful taking of life. Investigators assembled the case with witness testimony, body camera footage from prior incidents, and that phone recording. At trial, the state walked jurors through the landlord-tenant history and through the sequence immediately before and after the shooting, including the 911 call and statements that followed. The defense countered with a portrait of fear and deterioration, and a clinical expert spoke about adjustment disorder, a condition marked by heightened reactions to stressors, in an effort to contextualize Wink's mindset. Ultimately, the panel was not persuaded that her mental state or fear excused the act. In late June of the year 2025, the jury returned its verdict. They found Ellen Wink guilty of murder and also guilty in the criminal lockout case that had been tried alongside the homicide, a pairing the state had argued would show the arc of escalating conflict. The judge's announcement, delivered shortly before midday, marked the end of deliberations that needed no lengthy readbacks of testimony. The courthouse account from that afternoon captured a gallery that absorbed the decision quietly, with members of the victim's family expressing relief that the recorded evidence had been heard in full. Sentencing followed in early September. The court imposed a term of 50 years for the murder, a length that, given Wink's age of roughly 65, functions in practical terms as a life sentence. State officials issued a formal announcement detailing the sentence and identifying the presiding judge, and local outlets underscored how a public figure's fall from civic office to state custody had drawn intense attention. Coverage also noted that the victim was 54 years old, and that the dispute over rent, access, and property had been a constant drumbeat long before the day of the shooting. Psychologically, the case reads as a convergence of grievance, control, and fear. The defense's clinical testimony described a stress-based disorder. The prosecution countered with digital searches, prior warnings from police, and the tenant's own recording. The jury's choice suggests they saw intent and escalation rather than a sudden, unavoidable crisis. Today, according to state authorities, Ellen Wink is serving a 50-year prison sentence imposed in early September of the year 2025. 4. Larise King. Larise King speaks softly when she talks about family. Friends described her as protective, a woman who worked steady jobs, kept close to relatives, and held on tightly to her 2 children. She married Dathan, Day Gray, after years of an on-again, off-again relationship that mixed affection with conflict. As their marriage unraveled, arguments grew public and bitter. By the summer when the relationship finally broke, she was living apart from him, torn between resentment and the wish to be done with the turmoil. Investigators later traced the unraveling to a combustible mix of jealousy, wounded pride, and a desire to control how the breakup ended. Prosecutors said a confrontation earlier that evening escalated her anger. In the months leading up to the shooting, there were signs of brewing hostility accusations exchanged through texts, late-night calls, and friends pulled into the drama. What outsiders might have read as ordinary heartbreak, detectives came to view as plotting. The tension deepened into something colder, more deliberate, and ultimately irreversible. In the early hours of a late July morning, Dathan Gray was gunned down on a Bridgeport street. Prosecutors said Larise waited nearby in a car while 2 men approached, opened fire, and fled. He was struck many times, and he died at the scene. The killing stunned their community, both for its suddenness and for the allegation that a former spouse had orchestrated it. From the start, police believed the shooting was not random. It had the contours of a plan carried out with purpose. Police moved quickly. An arrest warrant followed, and Larise was taken into custody after initially failing to surrender as agreed. When the case finally reached a courtroom, The state's first major criminal trial after the pandemic pause unfolded before a panel of 3 judges. In a split decision, 2 judges voted to convict Larise of conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to murder. The court emphasized planning and intent, describing a calculated act rooted in domestic conflict. A few weeks later, she received a sentence of 50 years. The victim's parents spoke through tears about their son, and the bench noted Larise's limited remorse and refusal to name the gunman. Years later, appellate judges revisited how that verdict came to be. Connecticut's High Court ruled that before Larise chose to be tried by a judge panel, she had not been clearly told that such panels do not require a unanimous verdict. 2 votes out of 3 can convict. That omission mattered. The conviction was reversed, and a new trial was ordered. The ruling reshaped how courts must advise defendants who consider waiving a jury, ensuring they understand the special risks of a panel trial. Facing the prospect of another trial, Larise accepted a plea agreement. She admitted guilt as an accessory to first-degree manslaughter with a firearm. In court, she offered a statement of sorrow. The victim's family called the New Deal too light and said her words rang hollow. The judge acknowledged the pain on both sides and the limits of any sentence to repair what was lost. The plea carried a 20-year term with a mandatory minimum of 5 years and additional special parole to follow. The men alleged to have pulled the trigger have not been publicly identified or charged. She is currently serving a 20-year prison sentence with additional years of special parole to follow. 5. Nicole Pelletier. Nicole Pelletier presented herself as a devoted mother who kept close ties to her small Connecticut community. Born into a working-class family, she married young and settled in a modest home in the Terryville section of Plymouth. Friends remembered a woman who balanced childcare with jobs outside the house and who wanted stability for her children. Behind closed doors, the marriage showed strain. She confided to some that she felt controlled and afraid, and she began an affair with a coworker, a younger man named Jose Rubert. The secret relationship changed her daily rhythms and, over time, reshaped her loyalties and plans. By the late 1980s, stressors multiplied. The affair simmered alongside fears about custody, money, and the future if the marriage collapsed. Prosecutors later argued that resentment hardened into intent, and that Nicole repeatedly raised the idea of removing her husband from the picture. Witness accounts and later statements described earlier failed attempts in mounting pressure on Rubert to act. What some might interpret as a desperate response to a difficult home life, investigators read as a deliberate progression toward a fatal decision. In early October of 1989, in the family's Terryville home, the plan was carried out. According to court findings and later testimony, Rubert entered the house with access only someone close could provide and attacked Alador Pelletier with a baseball bat. The victim, 31 years old, died less than 2 weeks later. The act reverberated through the neighborhood and through extended family who had seen no public sign that a killing was imminent. In the immediate aftermath, Rubert told authorities he had acted alone, a claim that delayed the case against Nicole and complicated the early investigative timeline. Years passed. In the mid-1990s, Rubert gave a fuller account that implicated Nicole, and detectives revisited the cold case. By the summer of 2001, she was living in New Brunswick, Canada, when Connecticut authorities secured her extradition. She was arrested and arraigned in Bristol Superior Court, held on a substantial bond while awaiting trial. A jury later heard evidence of planning, motive, and the dynamics of the relationship with Rubert. In May of 2002, the panel found her guilty of murder as an accessory. Appellate courts affirmed the conviction, concluding that the trial judge had acted properly on contested evidentiary and jury issues. At sentencing, the court imposed a term of 60 years, reflecting the state's view that the crime was calculated and that her influence over the young lover was central to the outcome. In the years that followed, corrections, records, and filings documented a steady institutional record. Full-time work assignments, completion of programs, and an absence of disciplinary infractions. Her lawyers later emphasized remorse and acceptance of responsibility, arguing that any chance of rehabilitation should be recognized even in a serious case. In April of 2025, A superior court judge granted a sentence modification, reducing the term from 60 years to 40 years. The judge cited her conduct in custody and her statements accepting responsibility, while acknowledging the enduring harm to the victim's family. Psychologists have not published a comprehensive public report on her mental state at the time, but the record points to intertwined motives: fear of losing her children, a desire to control the outcome of a failing marriage, and reliance on a younger partner willing to carry out her wishes. The state's narrative centers on manipulation rather than momentary loss of control, whereas the defense has referenced abuse allegations that remain disputed in public filings. These competing frames shaped how the court and the community understood her role. She is currently serving a 40-year prison sentence following the 2025 modification. 6. Beth Ann Carpenter. Beth Ann Carpenter moved through courthouses with the steadiness of a young attorney who knew procedure and believed in preparation. In her early 30s, during the events that followed, she presented as methodical and reserved, a high achiever from a close Connecticut family. Ties to her parents and siblings were strong, and her niece's well-being became a central focus of family conversations. Within that private world, tension gathered around her sister's husband, Anson Buzz Clinton, a charismatic presence whose judgment and influence over the child were fiercely disputed. What began as a family rift slowly became the axis of every decision Beth made beyond office hours. Pressure mounted in layers, a custody struggle that hardened positions, arguments about boundaries and safety, and an intensifying relationship with her employer and romantic partner, attorney Heyman Klein. According to prosecutors, fear for her niece and anger toward her brother-in-law fused with access and opportunity. The state said she chose a path outside the courtroom, moving from advocacy to elimination, and leaned on an older partner who could translate intent into action. Defense arguments later emphasized family loyalty, a belief that a child was in danger, and the destabilizing pull of a codependent affair. Whatever the lens, the record shows planning that unfolded over months rather than hours. In early March of 1994, Anson Clinton was lured to a stretch of roadway near East Lyme and shot. The method signaled deliberation. Detectives charted his routines, telephone activity, and recent disputes, then widened the circle to examine connections to attorneys and clients who might have reason to intervene. Step by step, investigators tied a hired gunman to Heyman Klein and, through him, to Beth. The victim was not a stranger. He was family, and the motive the state advanced was rooted in custody, control, and a belief that removing him would resolve a domestic battle. The case did not end with the first arrests. As suspicion coalesced, Beth left for Ireland. Extradition negotiations stretched the timeline, with Irish authorities agreeing to her return after Connecticut confirmed the death penalty would not be sought. In New London Superior Court, a jury heard testimony from Klein and the admitted gunman about a contract killing arranged at Beth's urging. The defense highlighted Klein's addictions, credibility gaps, and incentives to cooperate, and Beth herself testified that he acted on his own. Jurors weighed those competing stories and, in the spring of the early 2000s, found her guilty of murder and conspiracy in a murder-for-hire scheme. Sentencing followed that summer. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Separate proceedings for Klein and the shooter resulted in lengthy terms measured in decades, but the state underscored that Beth's punishment carried no parole consideration. Appeals and habeas petitions continued into the late 2010s, pressing claims about counsel performance, evidentiary rulings, and media saturation. Courts rejected those arguments, describing the record as proof of sustained intent and the use of an intimate relationship to recruit assistance. Psychologically, the public record does not anchor a clinical diagnosis. Instead, it sketches a portrait of instrumental reasoning layered over family loyalty, a professional problem solver who, according to the verdict, decided that removal was preferable to continued conflict. Prosecutors framed her as purposeful and controlling, willing to use another's devotion to carry out her plan. The defense cast her as a woman overwhelmed by fear for a child and manipulated by an older, unstable partner. The courts, looking to actions before and after the crime, sided with deliberation over impulse. She is serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole in Connecticut. 7. Maggie Mae Bennett. Maggie Mae Bennett was in her mid-20s when the case finally reached a courtroom. A quiet young woman from New Milford who had grown up on the edges of an older crowd. Friends described a follower more than a leader, someone who moved between part-time jobs and weekend hangouts, attached to a boyfriend who kept a louder profile. Before the crime, her life looked ordinary from the outside. Family nearby, familiar stores, the same plaza where teenagers met after school. Behind that appearance, a smaller circle was hardening into a group with shared secrets and shifting loyalties. Prosecutors later said the pressure points were jealousy, fear, and the threat of exposure. The younger girl at the center of the case had begun speaking about what older men in the group had done to her, and rumors spread that police might be told more. In that atmosphere, bravado mixed with panic. Maggie's defense would emphasize her youth, her dependence on others, and the weight of older voices. The state argued that she made choices in step with the group's plan, and that even if she did not lead, she did not walk away. In the autumn of the late 1990s, a 13-year-old named Maryann Measles disappeared from a shopping area in New Milford. She knew some of the people who confronted her that night. Several were already entangled in her life. From there, the group moved her away from town. Months later, searchers found her remains near a boat launch on Lake Lilinona, wrapped and weighted in a way that turned a missing person case into a homicide investigation and a public heartbreak. The method, the setting, and the circle of acquaintances who knew the victim would frame every legal proceeding that followed. The investigation took years. Then, in the early 2000s, state police announced a sweep of arrests. Maggie was among 8 defendants. Unlike most of the others, she cooperated almost immediately. In the early spring of the mid-2000s, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit kidnapping, tampering with a witness, tampering with evidence, and risk of injury to a minor. As part of that agreement, a count of conspiracy to commit murder was dismissed, and she agreed to testify against remaining co-defendants if called. Her early cooperation became a defining feature of her case file. Sentencing came in the final weeks of that same year. The court imposed a 30-year sentence with 19 years to be served, reflecting both the seriousness of the crime and the weight given to her cooperation. In open court, prosecutors emphasized that she had stood by during the assault and helped after the fact. The judge acknowledged letters and statements from the victim's family and the lasting grief that had kept them returning to hearing after hearing. Of all the defendants, Maggie received the shortest term, a distinction the state linked directly to her assistance. A portrait of her role emerges from transcripts and filings, not a strategist, but present, not the spark, but part of the mechanism that moved events forward. The motives ascribed to her are common in group crimes: attachment to a partner, fear of retaliation inside the circle, the numbing effect of shared responsibility. There is no public clinical assessment that diagnoses a specific disorder. The record instead points to conformity, cowardice, and calculation by omission. Even her supporters described deep regret that came long after the harm was done. Years later, as the case returned to public view in documentaries and local retrospectives, officials noted that her sentence was nearing its end. After serving her time, she was released in the late 2010s, the only member of the group no longer incarcerated. 8. Sheila Davalloo. Sheila Davalloo was a pharmaceutical researcher in Stamford, remembered by co-workers as composed, ambitious, and intensely private. In her early 40s, when the case finally went to trial, she had once moved easily among office friendships and after-work gatherings. Behind the professional image was a volatile triangle. She was secretly involved with a colleague who had been engaged to another coworker, Anna Lisa Raymundo. Friends later told investigators that Davalloo seemed fixated on where that relationship stood from week to week, a preoccupation that steadily overtook her routines at work and at home. Stress mounted as her double life collided with her marriage. According to court records, she told her husband elaborate stories about fictional people whose dramas mirrored her own, asking him pointed questions about how evidence worked, about fingerprints and DNA, and even practicing with a lockpick set on their front door. Prosecutors argued that these conversations showed planning and escalating obsession rather than momentary anger. Appellate rulings later described those accounts as admissible, despite claims of marital privilege, noting that the talks were not the kind of intimate confessions that law seeks to protect. On a November morning, in the early 2000s, Annalisa Raymundo was attacked inside her condominium in Stamford. Neighbors heard a commotion, and a 911 call drew police to a scene that pointed to a personal motive rather than a random break-in. In the days that followed, coworkers and friends described tensions around a romance at the office. Detectives began to map phone records, movements, and small coincidences that, over time, formed a tighter circle around Davalloo. The victim and the defendant had both known the same man, and prosecutors would later say jealousy and control sat at the center of the crime. The break in the case came months later from a different act of violence, the attempted killing of Davalloo's husband in New York. That prosecution went forward first and resulted in a sentence of 25 years. As New York filings became available to Connecticut detectives, threads from the marriage, the invented characters, the lockpicking practice, the surveillance of her former lover were tied to the Stamford homicide. A decade after the killing, Davalloo chose to represent herself in Connecticut, questioning witnesses and challenging the state's theory while standby counsel sat nearby. A jury found her guilty of murder in the early weeks of that year, closing a long and complicated investigation. At sentencing in late April of that same year, the judge imposed a term of 50 years. The court ordered that the Connecticut time would begin only after she completed the New York sentence for attempting to kill her husband. In packed hearings, the victim's family asked for the maximum penalty allowed, speaking about a daughter and friend whose life had anchored the wider community of colleagues and neighbors. Coverage at the time emphasized that the case had started with a love triangle inside a high-pressure workplace and ended with two states imposing consecutive punishments. Across appeals, the legal focus narrowed to whether her conversations with her husband should have been kept confidential. The Connecticut Appellate Court and, later, the state's High Court upheld the conviction, concluding that those statements were not shielded because they were not made to preserve the marital bond, but instead to advance an outside scheme. The rulings also recounted evidence that Davalloo used deception to follow her former lover and probe his life with the victim, reinforcing the state's narrative of sustained planning. Psychologically, the record points to possessiveness and instrumental thinking rather than a sudden loss of control. Prosecutors described a careful, stepwise effort to remove a rival. Defense filings suggested jealousy and personal turmoil, but offered no clinical diagnosis in the public record. The courts, weighing behavior before and after the crime, found the pattern consistent with deliberate intent sustained over many months. She is serving a 50-year Connecticut sentence that will begin after she completes a New York term of 25 years for the attempted murder of her husband.